watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. Today we're talking to Daniel Webb, Director of Legal Advocacy at the Human Rights Law Centre. Let's now look at immigration policy under the Abbott government. The Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee is currently conducting an inquiry into changes which would increase the risk threshold asylum seekers will have to meet before they're being eligible for Australia's protection under human rights treaties. Daniel, what's your view on these proposed reforms?
My view on the reforms is that they will create significant risks that people who face the risk of harm, if returned, will nevertheless be returned to those risks of harm. I mean, a key aspect of these reforms is that they increase the risk threshold a person has to meet before being eligible for Australia's protection under certain human rights treaties. So Australia's got obligations under different international laws to not return people to a place where they'll face persecution. The Refugee Convention says we can't return people who face danger because of their race, religion, political opinion or membership of a social group. And then there are other conventions like the Convention Against Torture that say we can't return people who face similar risks but for different reasons.
And they're known as complementary protection.
Complementary protection,
yeah.
Exactly. The bill before Parliament now will increase the threshold for protection under those complementary protection treaties. They will increase it from a real chance of harm, which the courts have said is about a 10%, can be as little as about a 10% risk, up to, on the balance of probabilities, more likely than not, so a likelihood of greater than 50%.
So someone who might have been at risk of torture of, say, on average 10%, would now be returned,
Yep.
and it's only people we would take and give protection visas to who had more than 50% chance of facing the prospect of torture.
That's right. So if someone's claim falls outside of the Refugee Convention but inside one of those other treaties, say a woman who's fleeing the risk of an honour killing,
Yep.
Her claim would be covered by these other treaties. She would have to prove that she is more likely than not to be killed if returned. So if she proved to the government that she was 40% likely to be killed, under these reforms, the government would send her back. So we would assess her as being in danger and nevertheless send her back to face that danger. And I think that's unacceptable. It's definitely a breach of international law. I think it also sheds new light on the government's claims to be motivated by a desire to save lives at sea. I mean, it's no secret our asylum seeker policies are pretty cruel. They lock up children on remote islands, and we're told day after day that this is all necessary to save lives at sea. But if the government is really concerned about saving lives, why on earth would it be trying to give itself the power to return people back to a 50% risk of death?
And the proposed reforms also require protection visas to be denied to asylum seekers who've refused or failed to establish their identity, their nationality or their citizenship, or provided bogus identity documents. Can you tell me what your concerns are about that?
My concerns with that are that it just ignores the very nature of flight from persecution. I mean, the nature of flight from persecution is that refugees often can't ask the regime from which they're fleeing for help to get all their paperwork in order. They just flee, often without documents, often with whatever fake documents they need to get out. And so to assume that anyone who arrives without certain paperwork or who arrives with fake paperwork which they then destroy, to assume that they're here to game the system is a very unfair assumption, because it just fails to understand the nature of the circumstances from which people are fleeing. And it's for exactly that reason that the Refugee Convention says you cannot penalise an asylum seeker, you cannot refuse to protect them just because they come without authorisation. Our duty to protect, our basic legal and moral duty to protect, doesn't vanish just because someone doesn't have a particular piece of paperwork.
So I wanted to talk, there's been reports this week about Clive Palmer potentially agreeing to have temporary protection visas returned to the suite of protections available to asylum seekers in Australia in exchange for having children returned from Christmas Island and Nauru. Can you tell us what temporary protection visas are and what they might mean for people who would otherwise be entitled to permanent protection?
Well, I mean, by definition, I guess a temporary protection visa says to someone who we have assessed as having fled persecution, as having genuinely escaped serious dangers, it says to those people, we'll protect you and we'll let you rebuild your life in Australia temporarily. And I think that's a tremendously cruel way to treat people, to leave them in this perpetual limbo, because for every day that they're on a temporary protection visa, they go to bed not knowing whether one day they're going to be uprooted and returned. And that's a very precarious existence and a very harmful existence for people who've proved that they genuinely need our protection.
Now, you've been recently in the detention centre on Manus Island in PNG. Tell us what it's like there.
I mean, I'd read, I think, everything that had been written about what conditions were like inside Manus, and I was still shocked to see the conditions firsthand. It's shockingly overcrowded. I remember in one old World War II hangar, there were 120 bunk beds packed in so tightly that you literally couldn't walk between them. So shockingly overcrowded. The security presence is really overwhelming. There are sort of guards everywhere, and that gives the place a very hostile, prison-like kind of atmosphere. The facilities are in varying states of disrepair. You know, there were toilets with no water in them and things like that. But I think by far the worst aspect of the arrangements are that the men who are detained there have no idea if or when or to where they're ever going to be resettled. There's no plan in place about where we're ever going to send these people.
So that was one of the promises of Tony Abbott, that there would be a plan put in place for resettlement in PNG, but that has not progressed at all.
No, I mean, successive governments have described Manus as a processing centre and the agreement with Papua New Guinea as a resettlement agreement. But the inescapable fact is that it's been 21 months since we locked the first asylum seeker up on Manus, and not one has been processed and resettled.
Now, you're not surprised then by the government's recent discussions about no longer sending any new arrivals to Manus Island, instead diverting them to Nauru. Tell us why that is.
Because Manus is absolutely chock-a-block. I mean, it's just on a practical level, you can't send more people to a detention centre that's already overcrowded